And hello, everyone. Welcome to this career development workshop. And today we're going to have David Weinberger to tell us about academic paper writing. And just as a forecast, in 2 weeks from now, we're going to have another workshop on public outreach. So without further ado, let's have David get started on his presentation. And after his presentation, which is about 30 minutes, then we have open the floor for questions and discussions on the effectiveness and how do we best write an academic paper. All right, David, please take it away.
Okay, good. All right, everyone sees my screen, I presume?
Yep.
So, yeah, well, I'll try to sort of run through the slides reasonably quickly, and then we can take the discussion in whatever directions people would like to take it. And so I'm presenting this, largely as a kind of, a recipe for how you go about writing your first astronomy journal article or your 20th astronomy journal article. And this is, similar to the advice I give to my own graduate students and my typical practice. There are variations around around this, but I would also say this is aimed at, something like AppJ or monthly notices. Nature science is a different beast. Conference proceedings are a different beast. We could talk about those if people want. Okay, so there is a common phrase you hear, and I even sometimes slip into it myself about a paper or a project where you say, oh, it's basically done, now I just have to write it up. And I do think that the notion that writing it up is a different thing from doing the work is wrong on many fronts. I think that the piece that it does capture is that any project has what I think of as an opening phase in which the range of things you're looking at and exploring is getting larger, and you are finding new things and identifying new things that you should look into. And then there's a point at which that kind of opening switches to convergence, which is you've got a lot of your results in hand, you pretty much understand what you want to say, and now it's a matter of taking that whole volume of things that you've looked at and deciding which things are important for a paper, and which things do you need to further refine or further investigate, and so things start to shrink towards the thing you're going to present to the world. And paper writing is something that kind of starts as you go from that expanding phase to that contracting phase. But you learn a lot while you're writing, and that's because writing imposes a degree of rigor and explanation that you can often avoid if you're just jawboning about something. And so sometimes it's that, writing things and realizing, oh, I cannot explain this clearly, and I can't explain it clearly because I don't really understand it yet, or I haven't demonstrated that this explanation is correct. So sometimes, the process of writing pushes you back to going and doing new calculations, new explorations. So that's one sense in which, write it up is not separate from do the work. But the other thing is, the thing that lasts is the paper. And that actually is, that basically as scientists, papers are what we produce. And that's the thing that's going to have influence on the world. And, two people who have done exactly, the same calculations or observations and gotten equivalent results, the impact of the work they do can depend a lot on the quality of the paper, and it should, right? The quality of the paper should matter for whether other people learn from it. So as I say, I'm now going to run into this kind of step-by-step recipe for what happens in that contracting phase. This isn't the only way to do things. It's one that I find is effective for a large fraction of the papers I'm involved with. But as you gain experience yourself, you'll develop your own sort of preferred ways of going. But this is sort of one way to proceed that works for many papers. So item one is you have to have something to say. So if you don't have something to say, then you can't write a good paper, and you probably shouldn't be writing a paper at all. And so part of going from that expanding phase to contracting phase is having a sense of, okay, in a broad, at least viewed broadly, here is what I have to say, and therefore here's what the title, here's what the paper is going to be about. So once you've decided what you have to say in a broad sense and what your paper is going to be about, then for the kind of work I do, at least, the best thing to do next is make a draft set of figures that convey those main points. So often in the course of your research, you'll have made hundreds of figures. So you have to pick some very small subset that are going to convey the things that matter to the reader. There's no absolute rule on how many figures you can have in a paper, but in general, I would say, a long paper can support a maximum of about 20 figures, and a shorter paper can kind of support 5 to 10 figures. And so part of this making the draft set of figures is looking through all of your results and saying, what's a concise set of figures that can tell the story that you want to tell. Often the most effective figures are comparisons, comparison of observations to data, comparison of results of 3 different models. But I would say, this isn't the rule for all figures, but think of structuring your figures around comparisons between things. And in deciding how many figures you want, how many figures you need, just recognize that there's a trade-off, and basically each additional figure that you put in the paper is reducing the amount of attention that readers will pay to the other figures in a sort of proportional way. So basically you want to put in the smallest number of figures that you actually need to tell your story, but no fewer. So once you've got a draft set of figures, then you can kind of write down what are the points that you're trying to convey in the paper, and what's the priority of making those points. And some of those are big points. This behavior is universal among all galaxies. Some are small points that this this region in this galaxy has this interesting anomalous behavior. It's good to try to write down all of the things that you hope you will convey in the paper, and then think about the priority of them. And sometimes, part of what might happen in that is you'll decide, oh, this is so long that actually these lower priority points I just should leave out because they were interesting to me, but they're not sufficiently important. So then there's an iteration between steps 2 and 3, because your figures are there to convey your main points. So so making the figures will help you understand what those points are, but also then you find things on your list that aren't represented in a figure. And so you may then think, okay, I need a figure to demonstrate that point. Okay, so at this stage, I think it's good to choose a title, and I say it's a tentative title because sometimes by the end of your paper, end of writing your paper, you'll realize it's not the one you started out writing, and that the title should change. Also, it's good to decide what journal you're going to submit it to, in part because you need to decide what LaTeX template you're going to use, and so you might change, but pick where you think it's going to go. In terms of titles, I think that a useful exercise is to think, 15 years from now, you're going to have a curriculum vitae, and this paper is going to be listed on it. And for someone who is reading your CV and deciding whether you should get a grant or get a prize or get a job, when they read your CV, the information they are going to have is the title of the paper. And they may go research it further and read the abstract or the things, but a lot of times, what you see is a list of papers and the titles of the information that you've got. So someone who reads the title of your paper should have an idea of what it's about. And on clever titles with puns or jokes, I would, my advice would be clever if it really is clever, and if it's clever in a way that is tied to the science that you're doing. So a good title can make your scientific point memorable in a way that it might not otherwise be memorable. So that can be good, but 90% of my paper titles are boring, but they are informative. And 10% of the time I figure out something that's clever, and that's useful. So don't be clever for the sake of being clever. Okay, you've got a title, you've got figures. So this, I think, is when it's useful to make up a LaTeX file that has the figures in it, has your title, has informative captions. So informative captions means really explaining what's in those figures, and sometimes those captions at this stage will be longer than the captions you'll eventually have in the paper, because right now you don't also have text to go with them. So this is a way of starting to get down in words what your results are in a form that you can communicate to your co-authors. So they can be longer captions, but then you'll have to remember later on that you're going to have to trim them into some more usable form. Going, sort of here, I said before in talking about the list of figures, that in general, you cannot count on readers to get a point that isn't shown in a figure. And so sometimes, the natural expression for your point is an equation, or is a table, or is just things that you say in the text. And if you and there are things you can do in how you write things to try to make sure people get those things across. But as I'm sure you know from reading, you download the paper and you kind of start flipping through the figures, and the figures are things that what the people remember. So sometimes if you have an important point and it doesn't, and none of your figures are showing it, you have to invent a figure that is not absolutely logically necessary, but is rhetorically necessary because you need something to convey your that point. So also now you need to start thinking about who are the co-authors of the paper. If you're a student working with an advisor, your advisor will usually have lots of advice and thoughts on this. But in general, the principles are who's made significant contributions to the paper, and once you have that list of co-authors, and if you're in a big collaboration, there may be, I'm thinking here about who are the kind of lead author group, and not necessarily who's everybody who may eventually be on the paper by dint of having contributed data or something else. So decide on this tentative list and share this figure and caption file with them, and say, here's the results that we're thinking about putting into this paper, and if you have comments on the overall science content of the paper, you can do it now. So this is part of the reason for doing 5, and part of the reason for starting with figures is partly the logical flow for yourself of creating the article, but also it's being able to get to this step and have something that you can share with your co-authors that is not yet so far along that they don't feel like they can influence the process. So this is an intermediate product that you can share, and that your co-authors can use and respond to. So then you want to write an outline of the paper. Sometimes sometimes it's figures first, then outline. Sometimes it's outline first, then figures. But anyway, around this stage, you should be writing an outline. And the sort of bare bones of the outline are, for the most generic paper, there's an introduction, there's a section on methods or data, there's a section on results, and there's a section on conclusions. They don't necessarily have to be titled those things, although often they are. But that's sort of the 4 things that a generic paper needs. And part of what you should think about in your outline is, do you need more than those 4 basic sections? So it might be that your methods have, there are multiple components to it. There's a simulation part and an analytic part, or a simulation part and an observational part. And then you want to think about, are those 2 different main sections, or are they 2 subsections of methods? Your results, again, might have 2 or 3 different aspects. And again, you want to decide, are those sub pieces of an overall results section, or do they stand on their own as high level sections? Sometimes there is a discussion section as well as a conclusion section. Sometimes there's just one or the other. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. Sometimes, almost always, there will be previous work to compare to. sometimes that previous work, those comparisons will just naturally fit into the method section or the results section or the conclusion section. But sometimes that in itself is a sufficient exercise and of sufficient volume and sufficient importance that there should be a section that is comparison to previous work. So, so at the end of this, you want at least an outline that is that has the major sections and the subsections of those major sections. I used to be an extremely detailed outliner, and I would diagram things down to at least the paragraph level. And I do find that I think if that's your inclination, that is a useful way to go. But people have different balances, on where they like to outline versus when they want to start writing text. So then you've got your outline. Now you need to start writing text, and the question is, in what order? My typical advice is to start by writing the results section or the results sections. In part, that's once you have made the figures, then typically the results section is the easiest one to write. Because at least for the kinds of papers that I write, the results section is largely a description of what the figures are and what the tables are. So, typically it is, there's a paragraph that is figure 1 shows this and explains what's in figure 1. And then another paragraph that figure 2 shows this and explanation of what to conclude from it or what the structure is or how it was computed or other things. So in my papers, typically there's 1 to 2 paragraphs per figure. But sometimes you can cover multiple figures in one paragraph. Sometimes one figure takes a whole page of explanation and interpretation. But that's your starting point for the results sections, is run through the figures and describe them. Think about if some of your results belong in tables. Is it going to be useful to the reader to have a table of your numerical results? So is it necessary either as a complement to the figures or instead of the figures? As you start to write, you might have initially just said, I've got a results section, but then you realize that to sort of keep the logic clear, you want to have subsections, or you might have initially put in subsections and decided, well, actually, these are going to be sufficiently short that it's better to merge them together. Again, this is a point at which once you've got your results sections drafted, this is another good time to circulate to co-authors. And I guess an underlying theme of this is the communication with co-authors, and the fact that it may be, if you're writing a paper where there's you and your advisor and 3 collaborators at other institutions, you will get on those other people's radar, or even your advisor's radar at particular times when they have a gap to look at it among all the other things that they're doing. And so part of what you're trying to do in your communications with them is provide multiple chances for this to burst onto their radar and get their attention and get their response to you. So this is another good circulate to co-authors point. After results, then my recommendation is go back to the beginning and draft the introduction. Often people leave the introduction to the end, and they leave the introduction to the end in part because it's difficult and it's easy to procrastinate on the hardest part. But it is really hard to write the later parts of the paper if you don't know what you've already said in the earlier parts. So basically, after the results, my advice is you go back to the beginning and write in order. with the exception of the abstract, which we'll come to at the end. So various comments on introductions, of which the kind of the governing principle is write an introduction to your paper, and not just the introduction to some generic paper that could apply to 20 different papers in the field that you're working in. And this seems like an obvious statement, but now if you go look at other papers, you will realize what a large fraction of them actually have introductions that could have been introductions to, 80% of which could have been introductions to all sorts of other papers. So really think about what is the introduction that your paper needs. And a somewhere between guideline and rule that I try to follow. This is not universal practice, but it is my practice 80% of the time, is that somewhere in the first paragraph, or maybe the second paragraph, or at worst the third paragraph of the paper, there should be at least one sentence that says, this paper does this. There's a summary of what the goal of this paper is. And then you may back off from that and go to talking about other more background issues. But trying to follow this rule will push you to write an introduction to your paper. And again, this sort of seems like an obvious statement, but there are a remarkably large fraction of papers where you have to read a page and a half before there's anything that specifically says what this paper is about. Okay, so in general, the introduction is supposed to describe the background and the motivation. It gives reference to relevant previous works. You want to explain what's new about your paper, and often you'll have a paragraph that explains the structure of your paper. So sometimes that will be an outline in the last paragraph that says, we do this in section 2, this in section 3. For a simple paper, that's not obligatory. So, I think if the last paragraph of your introduction is in section 2, we discuss our methods. In section 3, we present our results. In section 4, we discuss our conclusions. I would drop that paragraph because it is not conveying much. But frequently, that last paragraph of the introduction will be a guide to how people should read the paper. Some papers need a broad review of the field introduction, but most of them don't. Most of them need, a review of what's relevant to the specific content of your paper. So don't automatically jump in and say, because this is a paper about chemical evolution, I need to give a general review of all aspects of chemical evolution for the paper. So sometimes, you will write some paper in which actually that broad review is justified, but don't go in automatically assuming it will be. Try to prepare in the introduction for those readers who are going to basically skim the introduction, look at the figures, and jump to the conclusions. So the introduction is important because it may be the only part of the paper that people read, or they read it to decide what they should do with the rest. And also, your introduction immediately follows the abstract, but I don't think you should write it assuming that the reader has just read the abstract, because at least my own experience is, frequently I will read the abstract of a paper, I will decide, oh, I should read that paper. But later when I come back to it, I just start in on the introduction. So I think that the abstract is its own thing, and the introduction isn't contiguous with it. Okay, now you go forward. So you draft the method section or the data sections. Your goal is to convey what's needed for someone to know what you did. You talk about tests or caveats about your results. I think the most important thing for people who are writing their first or second paper, is you've got to learn that the amount of time that you spent on something does not have to be proportional to how much text it gets in the paper. Right? So sometimes it took you a month to solve some problem that in the end, it's a sentence of the paper. And the most common thing that I find I need to correct in a draft written by someone writing their first paper is that they spent 2 months on that, and damn it, they want there to be 2 pages on it. But you should be thinking about the reader and what the reader needs to know. Okay, this is another breakpoint at which you can circulate the draft to the co-authors. Now you've got introduction, methods, results. Then, if you're going to have a discussion section as opposed to a conclusion section, or in addition to a conclusion section, you go to this. Discussion section is about the interpretation, the implications, comparison to previous work, investigation of uncertainties. All of these are things that may just come along in your results sections, but may merit a section of their own. Now you get to the conclusions. And so your final section can be titled conclusions. It can be titled summary. Maybe it is just discussion. And there isn't actually a section after that called conclusions. So think about the kind of subtle differences between what those words mean. Usually your conclusion section should be short. And if it's, if you find you're writing a conclusion section that's going to be 2 or 3 pages in the journal, then that may be the sign that, oh, you should really have a discussion section and a conclusion section. And on the other hand, if you've got a half-page discussion and a half-page conclusions, maybe those should be merged into one. This conclusion section, sometimes it's useful to have an enumerated list. We did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But not always. So, that depends on, that's a strategy to consider, but it depends whether it's the best way of conveying your results. Often your conclusions should have something about future directions, and think about the last sentence of the paper, and try to conclude on a good note. And it often takes me a while to come up with the last sentence of the paper. Okay, I'm gonna try to finish up so there's time to get to questions and answers. But you've got your draft set of figures. Now you've got the draft of everything. Now's a good time to really go back and refine those figures and captions. So pay attention to them being legible, to them being readable by people who are colorblind, things that highlight your data, all the things we talk about in coffee when we criticize people's figures. When you give talks, you will frequently go to your paper and extract the figure from the paper. And therefore, you want your axis labels to be big enough that you can show the figure in a talk and you don't have to add new axis labels just so someone can see it on a slide. So, pay attention to your axis labels, to your legends, to things being readable. So think about things that will be useful in talks as well as in the paper. The way I write captions, the first sentence of a caption is not actually a sentence. It's a title. So it is predictions of the model for the density profile of galaxies or something. So it's a statement, but then after that first sentence, everything else should be complete sentences, but written in a kind of compact telegraphic style. And try to limit the amount of repetition between figures and the text. I've gone back and forth on this over my career. I used to have a lot more repetition between figure captions and the text, but I've tried to move towards, it's either said in the caption or it's said in the text, but for the most part, not said in both places. If you have figures that are showing similar things, then you want to try to maintain consistency in their size, in their visual structure. So the the style of your figures is a guide to the reader for when they're looking at, multiple examples of the same thing versus something that has changed. So, don't alter which colors you're using to show which models unless there's a really good reason to do so. And this book by Edward Tufte, The Visual Display of Quantitative Information, is sort of a classic on both do's and don'ts of making figures. Okay, now now it's good to revisit the title and the author list. Is the title still the right title for the paper that you've written? Are there additional people who actually ought to be authors because now you realize what the content of the paper is? You write the acknowledgements. Here, consult with your advisor to get advice. Acknowledgements are something that are very specific from one paper to another. Appendices, do you want any appendices? So in general, appendices are the place for technical material that would disrupt the flow of someone who's reading the main text, but nonetheless might be useful or might be necessary as justification. And there are papers for which, the most important part of the paper is Appendix D. So if your paper should have appendices, then start writing those. Then draft the abstract. So this I do leave to basically the end because you kind of need to have the whole structure of the paper before you know what things you most want to convey in the abstract. And my advice on abstracts, there's one sentence or maybe two sentences that kind of set the scene. There is a long established correlation between masses of black holes and bulges of galaxies or something like that. Then after that sentence or possibly two sentences, you have a sentence that makes clear what this paper does and what this paper finds. I guess sometimes in general, that's the rest of the abstract, but there should be a real transition from a detectable transition from the sentences that are giving the background to the sentences that are saying what this paper is about. And again, sometimes you will read an abstract and, all the statements seem true, but you cannot tell what this, where they've switched from summarizing the field to saying what they did. It's good to be quantitative in the abstract. If you've got key numbers, report them there, report their error bars there. And increasingly, as we find things by searching with ADS and reading the abstracts. In general, if you don't have something said in the abstract, you cannot count on anybody remembering it as being from your paper, even if it is. So the important things have some mention of them in the abstract. Okay, this is my last slide. So now you reread and edit the whole thing. You'll have gotten feedback from co-authors. You may have been incorporating it as you go. If not, do it now. And my editing passes, I typically do 3 or 4 passes on a paper in editing it. But you just keep iterating until you get to the point of diminishing returns. Then you're done. You submit it. You post it to archive. You present a copy. You celebrate. And I'm a believer in posting to archive when you submit the papers, in part because you may get comments from archive readers that are valuable and that you want to incorporate in the revision. Keep track of those. So, typically the responses from archive readers will come in within a day or two, but you won't get the referee report back for a couple of months. So you need to keep track of those comments so that you remember to incorporate them when you revise the paper. And then at some point you will get a referee report and you will have to respond to it. So, my advice here is, very occasionally, you'll get a referee report that makes your heart feel warm. But often your first reaction to your referee's report will be, oh, what an idiot, or the referee didn't understand this part, or is harping about things that don't really matter. Once you've read it, breathe for a day and then read it again. And so the thing is, take the referee's report seriously, even if you disagree with it. Because the referee will probably read your paper more carefully than most of the people who ever read it. And even if the referee has misread it, this report tells you how someone who is expert in the field and has devoted effort to reading your paper may plausibly misread it. So if it's a good report, it won't just complain, it will give you advice on how you should change the paper. But often, the referee will say, well, I'm worried about this, this, and this, and it's up to you to figure out how you should change the paper to do it. But figure those out, make changes to your paper, write a response to the referee, and when you write that response, don't just respond to what the referee said, but say, here's how we changed the paper to address this point. Or that says, we disagree with this point and therefore we didn't change the paper, or something else. But your response should explain what you changed. And largely that's for the sake of the referee and the editor, but to some extent it's for you as well. If you find you've responded to a point from the referee, but you didn't actually change anything in the paper, then maybe that's because you missed something you should have done. Okay, I will stop there, and now we could discuss whatever people would like to discuss. So I'll stop share for a moment. If people want to go back to particular slides, we can go back to it.
Do we have any questions from David's presentation? Thank you so much, David.
I have a question. So going back to the captions. So you said that, maybe the first sentence should be sort of an extension of the title. And you also said that you're inclined to not having a lot of repetition between the caption and the text. I guess my question is, I've seen both extremes of the spectrum where people use the caption to mainly describe, oh, the blue points are these, the red points are this, the dash line is this. And I've also seen people, put that on the text and maybe on the caption just talk about the science of the figure. Like, what's your recommendation in general?
Right. So, first of all, that first sentence is, the title of that figure, right? So, so it is saying what is shown in that figure, but in the form of, a title rather than the form of a sentence. But now going on, so my feeling is that the, things like, the blue lines are this, the points are this, the dash lines are this, that all of that should be in the caption. And typically should not be in the text. Sometimes explaining, sometimes the simplest way of explaining a figure in the text will be to say, the solid line is representing this and the dash line is representing that. But in general, when someone's reading the text, they are not looking at the figure. So, the blue points versus red points or solid line versus dash line, that information isn't so relevant to them then. It's relevant to them when they are looking at the figure caption and have the figure in front of them. So, so that's the level of repetition that I particularly have. I would say I often used to, write those things in the text as well as the caption. And then I got some referee report that said, there's all this unnecessary repetition between the text and the captions. And my first reaction was, oh, it's useful to have that and the referee is just wrong. But, in truth, that particular referee report has stuck with me. And I thought, okay, yeah, maybe I can make my papers a little shorter by trying to reduce that repetition. So that part, I would say, you know, if everything about, you know, if there are different sets of points, if there are different lines, you know, that needs to be explained in the caption, and there should be enough information that someone who reads the caption knows what the different things in the figure are. So the real question is how much to put in the caption about what conclusions people should draw from the figures. And I would say, you know, so definitely those things should be in the text in terms of what the interpretation or implications of the figure are. That should definitely be in the text. And then the question is, should it be in the caption as well? And the argument that it should be is that some people will only look at the figures, and that's the chance to get it to them. And the argument that it shouldn't be is, you know, you already said that, and why? So for someone who is actually doing the work to read your paper, they're just reading the same thing twice. And there are arguments both ways. I would say, you know, mostly the way I now come down on that is that, you know, that the final sentence of the caption might be something about implications but even that I usually only do if, you know, for those figures where I think that's particularly important. And I would be very wary of having, you know, 2 or 3 sentences of interpretation implications in a caption. That's where I come down, but I would say, you know, that's the part that's most debatable of how much explanation should you have in the caption, because, you know, you're working for readers who explain things in different ways. Who will read the paper in different ways.
So then the structure of the caption would be the title, the dashed line and the blue points are this, the takeaway point is this.
Yep.
Okay. Thanks.
Any other questions?
So
I have, yeah, go ahead, Jai.
yeah. So I have a question for you, David. May I ask for your opinion about the idea that one paper should be about only one idea, not more?
So this is often said, one paper, one idea. I think that I would say that's, you know, a good motto, but not a good rule. What I mean by that is, if you have multiple major points that you're trying to make in one paper, then it is worth thinking about whether it makes sense to have those as 2 papers. But it's only that it's worth thinking about. It's not that that it has to be in 2 papers. And I would certainly say, you know, and I do feel like virtually all of my papers make more than 1 point, but they may have one major point and other subsidiary points, and I do think there's something to the 1.1 paper idea, but often, you know, the places where you don't want to lean into that too much are either that that, you know, there's so much explanation or background or observations that, you know, the second paper making the second point is going to have, you know, if the second paper making the second point is going to largely overlap the first paper, then, you know, then it's more efficient to put it into 1 paper. The other thing is, you know, frankly, for me, often if I decide I'm going to break this into 2 papers, you know, I get as far as writing the first one and the second one I don't get done. So so definitely one thing to keep in mind is, okay, am I really going to write the paper on this second point, or is it actually less important than the first point, and therefore the thing that will guarantee it getting out in the world is putting it into that first paper. So I don't think there's hard and fast rules here. I will say that a paper, a paper that gets remembered usually gets remembered for one thing, even if there are multiple things in it. And so that, I would say, is part of the argument behind 1.1 paper is that if you have two important points, and you put them in the same paper, then the bad case scenario, which is not uncommon, is that your paper doesn't get remembered at all. But the good case scenario is your paper gets remembered and recognized, but for one of those 2 points. So if they're both super important to get out there in the world, then you probably want to write 2 papers. And you have less control than you might think about what your paper will be remembered for. So I do have papers that I felt got to be pretty well recognized and remembered, but not for the thing that I thought was the most important piece about them. But that's a place where your title and your abstract matter in shaping what people are at least likely to take away as the important point of your paper.
Got it. Thank you.
And also, I think sometimes it's a trade-off between number of publication and a number of citations.
Yeah, and I would so this is something that will change over your career. So for graduate students and to some degree postdocs, the number of publications matters, and therefore that's a significant argument in favor of where you're close on this 1 paper or 2 paper thing, then it may make sense if you're as a graduate student or a postdoc to say there are 2 distinct things here, I should write them as 2 distinct papers so they appear as 2 different things on my publication list. And that is a legitimate consideration, provided that they really are that there really are enough things there to support 2 papers. And then as you get more senior, as Ji says, what starts to matter, and this is already true as a postdoc and kind of becomes more important the more senior you get, is you're going to be known not for your number of publications, but for your most important publications. And so now what matters is that the papers that you write are individually, that each one you write is a really good, important paper that has an impact, or at least that the best ones you write are ones that have a big impact. And so now you're kind of in the regime where if you split things among multiple papers, then it dilutes it to the point where no one paper is going to have as high an impact. So this is something where, the relevant considerations actually change with your career stage, and they're not necessarily the same for all of the members of your collaboration. And this is a good topic on which to have a conversation with your advisor about a particular project, but to take seriously their advice, because these are things where, you kind of, you learn from 2 decades of having done this, what actually works better as 2 papers and what works better as 1.
And also, I have some thought about writing introduction. So usually what I find is that my introduction is usually done halfway into a paper. This is because when I feel bored writing other sections, usually writing introduction is kind of a refreshing phase in writing that paper. Or if I work on multiple papers, I feel bored on one, I come back to the other one to write an introduction. So this kind of at least give me a mental break on the other things that I'm doing. So in that sense, an introduction is not always the last thing to write. If you ever feel bored, if you want to do, something that is refreshing, I think writing introduction could be something fun to do.
Yeah, so I would, and also plan in my recipe, it's never the last thing to do. It's the second thing to do. It's after the results section. And also I would say, yes, so frequently, if I'm writing the paper rather than advising my student how to write a paper, I frequently will write the introduction first because of this, how do I know what I'm going to say later unless I know what I've said in the introduction? But also, as Ji says, right, it's a different style. It's, the introduction, you're going to be reading other things, thinking about them, thinking about how they fit in, and it is challenging to write a good introduction, but it is challenging in a way that's, a break from debugging your computer programs or getting your plots to look nice. So it is a good thing to kind of, use as a break from other sorts of activities. I agree with that.
Do we have any other question?
I have a question. I'm wondering, what is your typical guideline for including your first author, for including people as authors? And let's say it's not a huge collaboration paper where there's 50 people that are getting the names on it. Let's say it's more sort of a half a dozen type of authors. What's normally your minimum amount of work to get your name on it?
So, right, it is tough to give general rules, and in part because it does, it does depend on how big the whole group is. But I would say that, if there's a material contribution, in the sense that if you had to remove what that person did, or remove the ideas you got from that paper, that, then your paper would be noticeably worse, then, that probably means they should be a co-author. Almost always, if they made a figure, or if they wrote part of the text, or they made a table, then that's something that almost always would merit at least an invitation of co-authorship. So the trickier part is, they were, they were involved in getting the observations, or they were on the original observing proposal but didn't stay involved in the project, or you had discussions with them, and those discussions were useful, but they aren't really a concrete contribution. So that's the point where you're trying to decide is the appropriate thing to make them a co-author, or to have them be or to put them in an acknowledgement. And I guess one thing I would look at is that your how does this potential additional author compare to whoever is the next person who did the least amount but is nonetheless a co-author. So there is this kind of continual chain of, you say, well, clearly this person should be, because they made this figure, and then you get to this person who didn't make a figure but who probably worked on 80% as much as this person, then you say, all right, probably that person should be a co-author. On the other hand, if that last person, worked 1/10 as much as the next one, then then maybe they shouldn't be. And sometimes, the right thing is to just have a frank communication. So I will sometimes, email someone and say, here's what other people did. Here's what I see as your contribution. I think that this level of contribution, is something that is appropriate to an acknowledgement, but probably doesn't rise to co-authorship on the paper. But if you feel otherwise, then let me know and let's try to talk it out. So I think that there are a number of occasions on which I've done that, or the reverse, saying, this is kind of what you've done is less than these people, but kind of comparable, and I would be happy to have you as a co-author. But if you think it's more appropriate for you to be in the acknowledgements, then we'll put you in the acknowledgements.
I wonder though, do you have tips specifically for like the really young students just starting out? Because these types of emails, I imagine it's hard for a first year grad student to email a professor at another university, say, look, I don't think you did enough work to be an author. So I wonder, any tips for that?
So my tip is get your advisor to write it.
Okay.
So if it's really a paper that's just you and you're the only person to communicate, you're the only person who can do that communication, then that's then often then you at least go to someone for advice, but nonetheless it may have to come from you. But it is. But typically, if it's my student, if it's a student writing a paper with me, then any of those sort of gray areas of authorship, I regard it as my duty to negotiate and not theirs.
And I recently run into a reverse issue is I forgot to acknowledge or forgot to include some people who should have been on the author list. So that is so I have advice for that. So usually I will advise the student to start paper writing as early as possible so that you have a draft. And whenever you talk to somebody, you feel like you inspire or you get a new idea, you write that down in a paper so that in the future you could acknowledge them. And if data is taken or some form of contribution from a collaborator, you write that down whenever you have that encounter, so that in this way you never forget to acknowledge, forget to include anyone who should have been on a author list. So so this is kind of the lesson I learned recently, because I forgot the people who took the data for me, right, which is really shame on me. So yeah, if I write that, like if I remember that contribution, write down in the draft, comment it out, I should have had that fixed right away. So hard lesson to learn, but I think it's worth sharing because it's never forgot to acknowledge any people who made a contribution to your paper.
One other piece of answer on this question also is, it is part of the reason that in my recipe, I emphasize, here's a breakpoint where send it to potential co-authors. Now, there may be people who will end up being co-authors and but are not so closely involved that they will be on those intermediate steps. But part of the point of having multiple stages at which you send things to people is to kind of, there may be someone who is, who if they responded to your draft set of figures, will become a co-author, but if they didn't actually respond at any of the intermediate stages, then that's the sign that they shouldn't be a co-author. And from the flip side, I would say that if I get sent a completed draft with an invitation to be a co-author, I usually decline. Even if I feel like I made some contribution. Often this will be with Sloan papers or something where there would be a contribution that I made that might merit co-authorship, but typically for me, getting something at that stage is like, okay, that was already done, so I don't want to be a co-author on that. So you really want to be giving potential co-authors the opportunity to give input at earlier stages, even if they don't. They still may only send you their input the week before you're going to submit the paper, but their attitude towards that will be very different if they have been, they've gotten 2 earlier versions over the course of a couple of months, right? And if the first time you get something is, requesting response within a week, for me at least, my reaction to that is just to be pissed off. And on the other hand, if I know I've been getting things for 2 months and I haven't responded, then my reaction to that is to feel guilty and say either, all right, I really better send my things now, or I'll withdraw from the paper. But giving your co-authors, this is if you're the first author of the paper, it is typically the thing that you are spending most of your time on, but that is most of your co-authors have full schedules of other things and they're trying to squeeze it in. So you need to give them time and opportunities to do that.
So when you send your first, maybe your first draft with the figures, just with the figures, and then I guess the subsequent drafts to the co-authors or potential co-authors, do you only ever ask for them to give you a response on the very last one? Or do you say, could you give me a response? Like, do you give them time frames for the other ones, or is it just like the final one that you ask for, like, for them to respond within a certain time frame?
I would say, in terms of saying, please respond within this amount of time, that to me is, when you're pretty darn close to the end and saying, that's when you say, I'm aiming to submit this in 2 weeks, or I'm aiming to submit it in a week, or I'm planning to, post it to the Sloan collaboration on Friday, and then it'll be submitted 3 weeks after that. I think the earlier stages are ones where, you don't actually know how long it will take you to go from having your figures to having a full draft of the text. So I wouldn't typically put a timeline on that, but but it can be as simple as you send it and you say, I welcome any comments you have at this stage, and I'll let you know when there's a major update. Or it can, you can be more specific in kinds of questions. So you're sending the figures and you're saying, I'm trying to decide whether it's important to, keep this and this, or whether we need something to show this. If you have thoughts on these, then please let me know. So if you can put specific questions in your circulation, then you are more likely to get response and input. And to be blunt, sometimes what you want in these are response and input, and sometimes what you're hoping is that people will look at it and say, oh yes, that's good, and not bug you. But the way that you So there's some element of, courtesy and meeting your responsibilities in sending people the intermediate updates. But there's also maybe this person is really going to give you some insight that was important.
Okay, let's spend the last few minutes to answer Rachel's question on the chat, and then we call it a workshop.
Yeah, so I think that I agree that this is a question, when do you declare victory, and that Adam is right that this is often the big challenge, is deciding when you cut this Gordian knot, and there isn't there certainly isn't a hard and fast rule, and it does depend on the paper. It does depend on the authors. It does depend on it does depend on other deadlines. It can be, so when I would encourage a student to submit a paper, will be different if they have to apply for jobs in 2 weeks than if they have to apply for jobs in 2 months. But I would say mostly I look for the point of diminishing returns. So if you're still at the point where each of these iterations, each of the changes is making something that you recognize as, the paper is still getting better as I add this or figure this out, then your bias should be to keep going. And on the other hand, you'll get to the point where, these are now minor improvements. And then that's the point at which you kind of stop and go ahead and submit. I think there is, there's some piece about the fact that you will be submitting this paper, you will get a response from a referee, and so there's some level of being able to say, here's a piece I'm still uncertain about, but I can, try to think about that and finish addressing it when we get the referee's report. And I think that is sometimes an acceptable strategy, and particularly that is sometimes an acceptable strategy if you're dealing with co-authors who are still, giving you things, saying, I still want you to look at this. I think sometimes an acceptable thing is to say, I think we're now at the point where we should submit the paper. I will continue to look at that. And, if we learn more, then we could address it in responding to the referee report. I think you have to be careful about over-relying on that, in part because it's not really the right use of the referee system to be sending papers that you don't actually think are ready for publication. And certainly if I'm a referee and the author has sent me a paper that I don't think they think is ready for publication, then I'm just pissed off, right? So that's one reason not to over-rely on it. And the other reason not to over-rely on it is that, sometimes those things that don't get done before you submit it the first time may never get done, or, the referee may not bring it up in your report. And then if you say, oh, and by the way, we made this other major change to the paper because we did this other calculation and found this thing that was wrong. That's embarrassing to have to put into your referee response. Nonetheless, that is one thing. But in general, I would say that as Poem brings up, there are points where what you want to say is that, here's a piece which, I'm still uncertain about, and I would have to do, this much work to become certain about it. And the right response is, I'm going to take it out because, and I'm just going to put in something saying, here is something that would be interesting to investigate in future work, and then you either will or won't decide it. You will or won't get to it. So particularly for things that are not the central points of the paper, sometimes the right response is just say, yeah, I can't nail that down. I'm going to drop it out. I think the hardest cases are things where you still have some nagging problem that makes you wonder about something that's actually central to the paper, and you just have not been able to figure it out. And you have to decide, do I keep banging my head against this wall, or do I go ahead? And there, I think, you try to find the strategy that where you acknowledge what your uncertainty is in the text. And, if you're transparent about, here is a piece that we still don't understand, and then that's, then you've kind of done your responsibility to readers and referees. And if you feel that writing that in the text is so embarrassing that you can't release the paper that way, then that's probably a good sign that actually you should still keep working on it. I think all these comments going in on acknowledgements are
right.
Good.
And people should feel free to leave. But I think Diego requests a last one. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a last question. So I see this in a fraction of the papers. To me, it sounds like a good idea, but I don't know why I don't see it that often, which is people in the conclusion section, they write the figure, we find this, parentheses, C figure X. Why, what's the con of doing that? Why don't people do that more often?
Yeah, I would say that, and I sometimes do it and sometimes don't. I do think it can, there are certainly virtues to the strategy of, here's the conclusion, figure this, here's the conclusion, figure that. I basically think that's a good idea, particularly in a long paper, that has a bunch of figures and, and a bunch of results. But also, sometimes it can feel like if your paper has 3 figures in it, then it seems, a bit much to do that. But so I would basically, go on the criterion of how useful is it to the reader for me to give, this guidance. But yeah, I think overall, maybe people, including me, underuse the putting in the reference to the figure for each of the conclusions points.
All right, I think we should conclude here. Thank you so much, David, for leading the discussion and also responding to all the questions that we have. The video will be online once I have the link and the password. And just to give you a heads up, what happened in two weeks. 2 weeks from now is going to be a workshop on outreach. And again, thank you everyone for your participation. Bye for now.
Bye.